This is lecture 8, the lymphatic immune systems. The lymphatic immune systems are two systems that are closely related. Whereas lymphatic system is comprised of mostly lymphatic vessels that collect excess tissue fluid, the immune system is not as concrete of a system. It is comprised of a collection of immune cells that serve to protect our body from foreign organisms. And these immune cells can be distributed around different places in our body, as we'll see later in this lecture. The main components of the immune system are the lymphocytes, which are B cells and T cells. But it's also comprised of lymphoid tissues and lymphoid organs. Now, the lymphatic system, its function is mainly to return the excess tissue fluid back to the blood vascular system. The lymphatic vessels collect this fluid and then transport it back to the bloodstream. In this image, you can see that blood capillaries are surrounded by loose connective tissue that contain the tissue fluid. The tissue fluid arises from blood filtered through the capillary walls and consists of small molecules of blood plasma, and that includes water, various ions, nutrient molecules, and respiratory gases. Even though fluid is continuously leaving and then re-entering the blood capillaries, for some complex reason there's usually slightly more fluid exiting from the arterial end of each capillary than those that re-enter the blood at the venial end. So the lymphatic vessels, they function to collect this excess tissue fluid from the loose connective tissue around the blood capillaries and then return them eventually to the bloodstream. Okay, you can see a series of lymphatic vessels eventually carry it back into the vascular system. So any blockage of the lymphatic vessels will cause the affected body region to swell with excess tissue fluid. And this condition, as seen clinically, is called edema. Elephantiasis is a condition that's characterized by tissue swelling due to an obstruction in the lymphatic vessel. And there are various causes, but one of the more notable ones. It's more commonly seen in third world countries like Africa and Southeast Asia. So one of these most notable causes is parasitic worms. So the worm can then cause blockage in the lymphatic vessels. And that fluid, because it's not able to be drained back to the vascular system, it accumulates in the tissue and causes this extreme regional tissue swelling. And in this schematic, we're going to revisit later. Now we're going to first look at lymphatic system, and then later in the lecture, we'll move on to talking about the immune system. The lymphatic system consists of lymphatic vessels that collect the tissue from the loose connective tissue. Okay, and that's mostly areolar and dense irregular connective tissue. Kind of a minor detail. So the fluid that gets carried back re-enters the great vein at the level of the neck. Okay. Once that tissue fluid enters lymphatic vessels, it's now called lymph. Before it enters the lymphatic vessels is interstitial fluid. Okay. And lymph flows in only one direction. It only flows toward the heart. But in addition to collecting the excess tissue fluid, lymphatic vessels also collect excessive blood protein. Okay, and this is an important point, because if the leak proteins is not returned, they are not returned to the bloodstream, The massive outflow of water from the blood to the tissue would then follow. Okay, because those blood proteins serve as a sponge. They attract water with them. So if you have an accumulation of blood proteins in this interstitial space, water is going to follow there and then cause the tissue to be swelled up. Okay, eventually the entire cardiovascular system would collapse from insufficient volume. So the blood proteins normally leak slowly but then steadily from the blood capillaries into the surrounding tissue fluid. Okay, and then the lymphatic vessels will pick these up and return them back to the bloodstream. And when all that's functioning properly, the proteins along with the fluid get strained, and there's no swelling. Now there is an order to these lymphatic vessels in terms of in which direction the lymph flows. We start with the lymphatic capillaries or lymph capillaries. These are the smallest lymph vessels, and they are the first ones to receive that lymph. They are highly permeable, as we'll look at the details later. Following the lymph capillaries, the lymph gets drained into collecting lymphatic vessels. And along with the collecting lymphatic vessels, there are scattered lymph nodes that you can find throughout these collecting vessels. And this is where those immune cells, the lymphocytes, are situated, and they come into confrontation with the different pathogens, invading pathogens, and then they kill those pathogens. Okay, and then following the collecting lymphatic vessels, those merge to form lymph trunks. Lymph trunks eventually merge to form lymph ducts. These are the largest lymph vessels, and these eventually drain into the veins in your neck. Okay, and we'll look at that in more detail later. But as we'll see later, the left side lymph ducts system is the most important because it drains 3/4 of your body. Now next we're going to take a closer look at these lymphatic capillaries. Lymphatic capillaries, they are located near the blood capillaries. They are highly permeable vessels that collect the excess tissue fluid. Like blood capillaries, their wall consists of a single layer of endothelial cells. Their high permeability results from the structure and arrangement of the endothelial cells. Okay. Specifically, they have very few intercellular junctions. Okay. That means there are gaps in between these cells, forming the wall of the lymphatic capillary. Also, the edges of those adjacent cells overlap, forming an easily opened mini valves. There are filaments of collagen that anchor those endothelial cells to the surrounding connective tissue. And so as a result, if there's an increase in the volume of tissue fluid around this lymphatic capillary, okay, then it's going to cause those mini valves to separate and opening up the gaps in the wall, allowing the fluid to enter into the lymphatic capillary. Okay, once that fluid enters the lymphatic capillary, it's now called lymph. Lymph cannot leak out of the lymphatic capillaries because the backflow will force the mini valve flaps close together, okay, and shut them off. Even though there's a high permeability of these lymphatic capillaries that allows for the uptake of a large quantity of tissue fluid and large protein molecules, but that also means it allows for any bacteria, virus, or cancer cells in the loose connective tissue to enter these capillaries with ease. And these pathogenic agents can then travel throughout the blood via the lymphatic vessels. However, this threat is generally averted in part by the lymph nodes, which contain those lymphocytes and are able to destroy most pathogens that are in the lymph. There is a specialized type of lymphatic capillary located in your small intestines. They're called lacteals. So lacteals are a specialized type of lymphatic capillaries specifically found in the villi of your small intestine. Okay, remember what your small intestine, its functional role is. It functions to absorb nutrients. So this is also where fats get absorbed. When fats get absorbed, unlike the other nutrients that enter blood capillaries, fat actually gets absorbed into the lacteals, into this lymphatic capillaries. Okay. So essentially, lacteals absorb digestive fats from the intestine, and that causes the lymph draining from the digestive viscera to become milky white. And this fatty lymph is called chyle, C-H-Y-L-E. Okay. And like all lymph, it's carried eventually back to the bloodstream. Chylothorax is a rare but serious condition where there's an accumulation of lymphatic fluid in a space around your lungs. So that's called the pleural space. So that chyle accumulates in the pleural space. And chyle can accumulate in the pleural space due to either disruption or an obstruction of the thoracic duct. And we'll take a look at where the thoracic duct is later. So as you can see the chyle accumulating here. After the lymph passes through the lymphatic capillaries, it next drains into the collecting lymphatic vessels. Collecting lymphatic vessels are narrow and delicate, and so they're not usually seen in a dissecting laboratory. They are accompanied by blood vessels. They're actually composed of the same three layers as blood vessels. Okay. They're structurally somewhat similar to veins. However, they contain more valves than even veins. Their walls are thinner than veins, and this reflects the fact that lymph flows under very low pressure. Okay. And this has to do with the fact that lymphatic vessels are not connected to the pumping heart, unlike your blood vessels. And to help direct the flow of lymph back to the heart, lymphatic collecting vessels will contain more valves. This image shows the general distribution of the different collecting lymphatic vessels around your body. Now, following those collecting lymphatic vessels, the lymph now will travel into the lymph trunks. The largest lymphatic collecting vessels, they converge to form these lymph trunks. And then these trunks, they drain large areas of the body, and they're large enough to actually be found by some dissectors. Okay. There are 5 major lymph trunks. There's the lumbar trunk, there's intestinal trunk, okay, subclavian trunk, jugular trunk, and bronchomediastinal trunk. And these, I'm going over it kind of quickly because I don't require you to know any of them. Okay, not for this class. Eventually, these lymph trunks will merge and drain into lymph ducts. And there are two major lymph ducts that we're going to talk about in this class. Well, there are two major lymph ducts, period. Okay. The most important one is the so-called left-sided lymphatic system, which is the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct, okay, begins in your lower half of your body. And the cisterna chyli, which means the sac of chyle, it's essentially the lower portion of that thoracic duct. It comes from emerging of the lumbar and intestinal trunks. Okay. And is one of the reservoir that holds the lymph and other bodily fluid found in the lymphatic system. It essentially receives and then temporarily stores lymph as well as body tissue fluid as it traverses upward in the body. From there, the thoracic duct will ascend along the vertebral body. Okay. And then in the superior thorax, it turns left and then empties into the venous circulation at the junction of the left internal jugular and the left subclavian veins. Okay, that's where it empties into the vascular system. And then we have the right lymphatic duct. So we just talked about thoracic duct, which drains 3/4 of your body. Okay. It drains the left side of the head, the neck, the thorax. It also drains the left upper extremity and the entire lower half of your body. Now the right lymphatic duct. Okay, so usually the right upper quadrant of your body is drained by 3 different lymph trunks. Okay, which the names of which I don't require you to know, but they're the jugular, the right jugular, right subclavian, and right bronchomediastinal trunks. But in about a fifth of the population, these will join to form a short right lymphatic duct. Okay, and when this is present, this duct will empty into the neck vein near the junction of the right internal jugular vein and the right subclavian vein. Okay. In that case, this duct is responsible for draining this right upper quadrant part of your body. This is just another enlarged visual illustrating the same point. You can see the drainage point where the lymphatic system, okay, joins the vascular system is at the junction of these internal jugular veins and the subclavian veins. Just another illustration. Now, you're not responsible for knowing the anatomy of these lymph nodes. What I do want you to understand is that they have a very important function in cleansing the lymph. Okay. This is where your T cells and B cells encounter those pathogens and then kill them. Your body contains around 500 lymph nodes. And they are superficial lymph nodes that are palpable, meaning that you can feel for them on exam, particularly when they're enlarged. Okay, due to inflammation, it could be due to an infection or due to cancer or other reasons. Okay. And those I actually want you to be able to identify and recognize in an illustration. Okay. And those are the cervical lymph nodes, the axillary lymph nodes, and the inguinal lymph nodes. There are some deeper lymph nodes. I don't want you to worry about them. Okay, so your cervical lymph nodes are located in the neck. Following, you can feel for them along the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Okay. And then the axillary nodes, they are located in the armpit. The inguinal nodes in the inguinal region. And so you can feel for them clinically. These are things that we check for regularly on clinical exam. So this concludes our description of the lymphatic vessels. And to recap their functions, essentially these lymphatic vessels, they first of all return that excess tissue fluid back to the bloodstream. They also return leaked proteins back to the blood. And finally, they carry that absorbed fat from the intestine to the blood. Okay. And remember those lymph nodes, they lie along those lymphatic collecting vessels, and they help to fight infectious diseases. Now, immune system. The immune system, okay, is composed of immune cells, different immune cells. The particular one associated with the lymphatic system are the lymphocytes. So this is the one we're going to talk about. And we'll talk about the rest as well when we talk about the blood chapter. These immune cells, they recognize specific foreign particles, and they're able to destroy these intruders effectively. So one of the key cells making up the immune system are the lymphocytes. The T cells and the B cells, or T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, when you look at them microscopically, you can't really tell them apart. Okay. So they're both gonna look like this. The immune system includes the lymphoid tissue and the lymphoid organs. The lymphoid organs are these more discrete, including the lymph nodes, the spleen, the thymus, the tonsils, and the appendix. And then there are separate dispersed lymphoid tissue that's known as aggregated lymphoid nodules. These are not lymphoid organs. These aggregated lymphoid nodules can be found in different parts of our body, and one of the types is called mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MOLT for short. Okay, and they can be found underlying any mucous membrane. So as you can imagine, they serve as a first-line defense. Whatever pathogen is trying to invade your body, okay, these are ready to attack. Okay. When they are found in the distal part of your small intestine, these molts are specifically called Peyer's patches. And you have similar tissue found in appendix. Okay, so appendix is also considered an immune organ. So what does MOLT, or mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue is? It's a diffuse system of small concentrations of lymphoid tissue that's found in various submucosal membrane around the body. And that includes your GI tract, your gastrointestinal tract, your oral passage, your nasopharyngeal tract, okay, the thyroid, etc. Okay, and these MOLT, they are populated densely with lymphocytes like T cells and B cells. Okay. And this is why they are well situated to encounter those antigens, those intruders, okay, that are trying to pass through that mucosal epithelium. You can see here, these are those nodules. Okay. Now we're going to talk about lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are triggered to act by infectious organisms. Okay. And those organisms can be those organisms can be attacked by macrophages, granulocytes, or lymphocytes. Okay, so the lymphocyte is the one we're going to talk more specifically about. The other two will wait until the blood unit. The lymphocytes specifically can recognize certain specific foreign molecules. Okay. And the details of the immune response is something that you're going to learn about in physiology. There are various subtypes of T lymphocytes. The one we're going to address right now is the cytotoxic kind. When they encounter the foreign cell, they can attack those foreign cells directly. Okay. It causes those cells to lyse the membrane and then signal that cell to kill themselves. In such a way, it's able to destroy cells that have been infected by viruses and some cancer cells. Okay. On the other hand, B lymphocytes or B cells, they cannot attack directly. The way they act is through their secretion of antibodies after they become plasma cells. We're going to see that on the next page. And these antibodies, okay, are then able to bind and mark those foreign cells. And that flag, that tagging with the antibodies, tells the macrophages to attack these cells. Okay, that have been the cells that have been infected. So here you can see the T lymphocytes acting directly to cause the cell to die, whereas the B lymphocyte, which looks very much the same, okay, except molecularly they have different receptors on the surface. So these, when they recognize there are invaders, they give rise to plasma cells. These plasma cells, they are like protein factories. They make lots and lots of these proteins called the antibodies. Antibodies then will bind to the antigen on those pathogens and then mark those foreign cells for destruction. This is where the macrophage comes along and recognizes the bacteria because now it's tagged with the antibodies. And then the macrophage then can phagocytose and kill those bacterial cells. Okay, lymphocyte activation is a topic you're going to discover more about in physiology. Okay. The lymphocytes, like all blood cells, they originate from the bone marrow. Okay. But then the T cells, they mature in thymus. Okay, so the ones that travel to thymus to mature, they become T cells. Okay, and then there is a population that stays in the bone marrow. Those become the B lymphocyte. So whereas the B lymphocytes mature in bone marrow, T lymphocytes mature in thymus. The lymphoid tissues, they are a very important part of your immune system. Okay. They can be found in the mucous membranes of these different various places. Okay. So if you consider the fact that the food you eat, right, and nothing is really sterile, so every time you eat something, there's also always a lot of bacteria in it. Right? So that means your digestive tract has to be lined with a lot of these immune cells in order to be able to fight off whatever at least most of the bacteria that you ingest. Okay, that's where those aggregates of lymphoid nodules are for. Okay, again, this is the Peyer's patch. The lymphoid organs can be categorized into the primary lymphoid organs and then the secondary lymphoid organs. There are really only two primary lymphoid organs, and those are the bone marrow and the thymus. Okay, because these are the only places where those lymphocytes mature. Remember, bone marrow is where B cells mature, thymus is where T cells mature. Secondary lymphoid organs, there are quite a few. Okay. And their function is to gather and destroy those infectious microorganisms and then to store the lymphocytes. Now the thymus, this is where those T cells mature. And this is an organ that's most active in childhood. Okay, so when you take the X-ray imaging of a child, oftentimes people think this is heart, but this is actually the thymus. This is how large the thymus is. It takes up, a third to a half of their whole chest size. Okay, this is the thymic shadow. Okay, with development, as we grow older, it atrophies and eventually becomes much smaller. And now this is the heart. Okay. The spleen is the largest lymphoid organ in our body. It's got two main functions in blood cleansing, in cleansing our blood. One is removing the bloodborne pathogens, its immune function. The other is removing the defective or non-functioning blood cells from our body, whether it's our red blood cells or our platelets, etc. It also has a function in hematopoiesis in a fetus. So hematopoiesis is blood cell formation. Okay. This is where B cells get converted to plasma cells. Okay. This is also where there is phagocytosis of bacteria, as well as the defective red blood cells, and platelets. Finally, the spleen stores a large amount of platelet. Okay, but it can sequester too much platelet, and causes your blood platelet level to drop. And so in that case, the person has to have their spleen removed. The procedure is called splenectomy. The tonsils, your tonsils are the simplest lymphoid organs in your body. There are 4 groups. You have the palatine, the lingual, the pharyngeal, tubal tonsils. So these, I'm not actually going to test you on. But underneath the surface, in that lamina propria, is where you'll find the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. Now this concludes our lecture.